Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome back to Beyond Earth Civilization. So we're going to try and do our retrospective of this game a little bit better than last time. As I told you the other time, that was like 4 in the morning, I'd done a lot of takes, there were a lot of technical problems that were sort of messing up my ability to actually make that video, but you know, I figured I'll throw it out and show you guys sort of the process that I go through, but this one hopefully going to actually be viewable. So anyway, Civilization Beyond Earth is a 4X type strategy game, and 4X means explore, expand, exploit, exterminate. And that is basically the different phases of the game that you sort of progress through naturally when you're doing this. Of course, you don't have to exterminate your opponents in Beyond Earth or any of the other 4X games that are really worth their salt. You could also opt for something like a diplomatic victory, a scientific victory, and these are pretty much hallmarks of Civilization in particular, but also Galactic Civilization and Alpha Centauri have these sort of features. Beyond Earth, of course, has different conditions. They're sort of faction specific as opposed to being culture or science. They're all ultimately fairly science based, but that is to be expected. It is the future where science matters more than culture, I guess. Well, I guess when you're on a hostile alien planet, I would really trust the guy who's talking about science more than the guy who's saying that I should learn how to speak more languages. Anyway, we've got ourselves a game that is pretty firmly set in that genre, so for those of you right away off the bat who are not interested in the 4X genre, you should probably walk away from this series. For those of you who are a little bit interested, but who don't necessarily know about the 4X genre or haven't ever played a game in it, I would not necessarily recommend jumping straight into Civilization Beyond Earth first off. There are games that are sort of more transitionary to that from regular strategy games or for easier types of strategy sort of games without being an actual 4X strategy game that sort of are good transitionary ones. Age of Wonders 3 is an excellent example of that, but if you've never played a 4X game before, and this does look interesting to you, by all means try it out, but there are definitely easier ones to get into if you're unsure, and you know, definitely if you're not, if you're new to this sort of game. They have a lot of sort of jumbled math and mechanics and charts and stuff like that that you sort of need to be aware of and look at and optimize. Otherwise, you're going to fall behind and usually lose, which can be very frustrating. But you know, you can learn how to play these games quite quickly and quite easily otherwise. So, onto the game itself. We need to talk a little bit first of all about the different factions. There are only 8 of them, which is a pretty big problem in terms of variety. Now, personally, I do like having more factions as an option, and I do think that this will be rectified through DLC fairly quickly. And honestly, this is mitigated tremendously by the use of the colonists and the ship and the cargo system. You can actually use that combination of stuff to make it so that you've got a fairly varied start compared to each other gameplay. It's just that I do think that having more obviously would have been better, mostly because I want to be able to play a map that has more than 8 players on it. It would also mean that they could increase the map size limit a little bit beyond what it currently is, but that's not a huge concern, and I think it will be solved through DLC. So, moving on from there, let's talk a little bit about faction balance in particular. This is going to be an important part of a game like this. It's never fun to play an RTS-style game when one side or a certain number of things are completely broken or out of whack, because unlike, say, Street Fighter or whatever, you know, you're not fighting just specific things that are within your own tier bracket. You're fighting like all the other factions simultaneously. So if you've got someone like Poland, for example, from Civ 5, who is just rolling through Europe, or whatever continental landmass happens to exist at the time, because they're a little bit overpowered, you're going to find yourself in a little bit of trouble. Beyond Earth doesn't have anyone quite that egregious. They do have a couple factions that are more powerful than others. Australia, I find, is quite powerful. I think almost everybody universally thinks that the Pan-Asian Cooperative is very powerful, and I do think that the Cavathan Protectorate is on the weak side of things. Their abilities just do not necessarily bode well for them in any particular way. They're just not particularly good at pursuing any type of strategy. Now, Paul Australia and Pan-Asian Cooperative are both very strong because of their special abilities, but neither of them are overwhelmingly so. Maybe Paul Australia sometimes, but rarely. So, basically, Paul Australia starts off with 4 trade routes from their capital, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but trade is a massive thing in this game. It has been sort of hyper-emphasized. So the fact that they can start off with 4 trade routes means that their economy is chugging along, usually with a pretty sizable bonus early on in the game, and it means that they're going to typically end up with significantly more resources early on. Moving up from there, though, you start moving into the Pan-Asian Cooperative's ability to produce tile improvements faster is an extremely powerful bonus as well, because of that similar thing. Early on, they're just going to be generating far more tile bonuses than other factions are, especially if they started with a worker. So these sort of factions, I think, are a little bit more powerful than the other ones, but all in all, the balance seems pretty good. Everyone else seems pretty level. I played almost as everybody except for... Actually, no, I have played a game with absolutely everybody already. That's another thing about having only 8 factions. It's like, I kind of want to try out more of them, but, you know, whatever. Gotta say, my favorite one right now is probably Arc. I really do like the spy focus there. So, anyway, moving on from there, let's talk about the balance of the colonists. Unfortunately, colonists is probably the most broken of the systems right now. Currently, I only ever run artists, and the reason for this is that early on, it's very difficult to get very much culture. Like, you'll get your relic, Old Earth relic or whatever, which is good. It's not great. It's just that once you've got that, you're going to basically be stagnant on culture for a long time. And if you're trying to compensate for this by building more cities with more Old Earth relics, then you're going to actually fall further behind, because every time you build a city, the cost of virtues goes up. So you're not actually doubling the amount of culture you're producing by building a second city. You're actually increasing it by a fairly regular margin, a different margin than that, that's smaller. So at that point, I do find that that's the best one. Now, the reason that science, which is also sort of works in the same way, is not as good as that, is that there are far more science building options that are worth building early on. So typically your culture, for example, like cyto-nurseries and clinics, for example, both provide science, as well as labs, observatories. There's a countless number of options that provide science early on. So the science number usually far outstrips your cultural value. So you're usually seeing people with like science scores in the 50s when they've got a cultural score in the 20s. And that means that that +2 bonus to science just doesn't mean as much. So the health bonus becomes the big determinant between them. If I'm going to have like the +2 science bonus without the +1 health bonus, the culture ends up being better on 2 fronts. It's scaled better into that point in the game, and it's also providing the health bonus, which is massive, especially as you produce more cities. So unfortunately, that one is a real standout there. You could also take health, or sorry, you could take food. If you could take health, that'd be amazing. But the problem with food is that as your city grows, like normally people say that like growth is super important in civ games, and that is true in this one as well. It's very easy to get a good food number through trade routes. Same with production, and so I don't typically find that that's necessary to get that through the colonist type. And of course, then aristocrats, money. Again, it's usually not as much of a problem to get money in this game as compared to normal civilization. But on the other hand, aristocrats is a fairly large amount, and it does come with a health bonus. So actually, I do like aristocrats. There are certain starts where you just don't have any money. I would say that's just a little bit after artists, and that's because, again, it comes to that health boost. Anything that gives a health boost is going to have that leg up over their competition, and the money can be extremely helpful early on in the game. So, moving on from there, let's talk a little bit about the different ships. You've got a lot of different variety of different good ones here. I like all of them except for the alien scanner, which I find a little bit unnecessary. It's good if you are doing certain types of adventuring and exploring, but ultimately you don't need it. So, it's definitely my least favorite. Now, everything else has its specific uses, and this is where you start getting into the nitty-gritty of how you're going to be starting off your civilization. For example, retrograde thrusters is if you want to build a single super city, and you need to make sure that that single super city that you start off with is in a great position. Now, this can backfire if none of your tiles are any good, or if your central tile is an amazing place to start anyway, in which case you've kind of wasted the retrograde thruster and don't need to have used the bonus. Continental Surveyor, similarly, if you're landlocked, is not very useful because you can't abuse the fact that you have line of sight through all those coastal tiles to start trade, which is the biggest advantage to having those coastal tiles. starting sea trade without having to explore is just amazing, but it, again, is situational, can backfire. And then there's like the tectonic scanner, which is great if you want to expand early. The fusion reactor, which is great if you don't have any particular strategy in mind and want to be able to adapt on the fly by buying a quick something early on. All of those are a really great way to sort of augment your particular playstyle and what you plan on doing. So moving on from there, let's talk about the cargo. The cargo, again, all of them are pretty good. I've used a lot of them in different circumstances, depending on what I want to do. For example, if I want that big super city early on, I'll often get workers. If I want to build a fast expansion, I'll start with pioneering, or if I want to focus on trade, I'll start with that. If I want to start exploring the map very early on to try and secure relics and old resource nodes or whatever, I will often start with soldiers. So all of them sort of have their uses that you can use in conjunction with your faction ability and your ship ability to sort of formulate a different type of start, to formulate how you're probably going to try and guide your civilization, whether it be fast expansion, whether it be a single super city, whether it be moving sort of around and collecting archaeological relics and stuff like that. All of those are sort of dictated by that to a certain degree, and of course where you end up landing. So I do think that the game's system of choice at the start is a very good one, and it provides a lot of interesting strategy that you can start before the game, and a lot of risk and a lot of reward that you can potentially gain from it. So, anyway, after that, let us start delving into the game itself. Alright, so the meat of the early gameplay is the biggest difference between Civilization Beyond Earth and Civilization 5, and it's really a dramatic improvement over the exploration phase of Civilization 5. Now, I'm going to have to talk about those two in comparison to one another primarily, but I can also talk a little bit about that in comparison to other 4X style strategy games. Now, in Civilization and most 4X games, how you explore the map is basically just you try and cover as much ground as is possible. In Civilization, this is basically so that you can acquire knowledge of the map. Well, that's all games, is to acquire knowledge of the map, but in a lot of them it's also to acquire little resource nodes that are usually scattered to sort of encourage that exploration. It was the ancient ruins in Civilization games, it's those resource pods in Civilization Beyond Earth, and it's the like little weird farms and stuff like that littered around in Age of Wonders 3. It's scraps and stuff like that that you find, spatial anomalies in Galactic Civilization. So all of them provide these little resource hubs for you to sort of go gather, try and reward people to explore. And they range from sort of really lousy, bad ones like reveals barbarians on the map, to really extremely powerful ones like free writing technology. And the same goes for like Age of Wonders. You know, you've got the little huts that sometimes just give you like $10, and you've got another one that gives you a shitty unit. Then you get the other ones that give you like a big boost in something else. But you know, Age of Wonders is the one that I think the sort of exploration is probably the least enticing at the beginning. But that aside, you need to sort of strike a different balance in this between how much you're willing to give players for these sort of things, how random it's going to be, all that other stuff. I think Beyond Earth probably does the best job of this. And they've also made the exploration phase a little bit more exciting because they've made some sort of different choices in terms of how you scout. Now, in other games, it is traditionally you just try to get as much vision as possible. That's how you move your units. That's the sort of motivation you've got between their movements. And the only thing that could really stop you is either an enemy unit, which is going to be generally arbitrarily hostile, or just in your way, as in Age of Wonders 3, or it's a mountain. Like, you've got mountains in your way, they're just impassable. Both of these provide sort of levels of how impassable they are. A barbarian in Civilization is impassable for a scout, but not impassable for a soldier. But ultimately, you can just sort of sack their camp and then go on through. Mountains, you just can never go through, so they provide a scouting barrier. And depending on how they're positioned, this doesn't really provide interesting choices. I mean, it could provide the choice of do you go left or right around the mountain. That's about it. In Civilization Beyond Earth, they've added some other elements and changed the way that the aggressive AI works. So, at the start of the game in Civilization Beyond Earth, you've got a lot of miasma. It hasn't been cleared out yet. You haven't gotten your immunity to it if you're going to. Basically, it's just shitting up the map. And this provides a lot of interesting choices, like how far are you willing to explore into the miasma? Are you willing to move your worker and end its turn in miasma just to shave off a little bit of traveling time? Or are you considering that you're going to have to heal up that explorer afterwards? Is it worth just turning straight through, or do you wait a turn so that you can sort of skip a miasma tile for one turn? And that sort of makes it a lot more interesting and dynamic during that scouting phase. You've got a lot more choices, and similarly, the aliens who are not just sort of arbitrarily aggressive become a very interesting mechanic to the game in the early phase. If you've got an alien nest and it's near a narrow pass, there's always the possibility that you can squeeze past it without causing the aliens to become aggressive to your worker, or sorry, to your explorer. But that's not really possible in Civilization 5, where the barbarians, if you've got a scout there, they'll just be aggressive to it and probably kill it if you're trying to push it past a barbarian camp near a pass. That just is not all that dynamic, because it's either you definitely don't go past it or you do go past it. In Beyond Earth, there's a risk, but you could also definitely squeeze through potentially. And similarly, do you go about using your early soldier to exterminate them? Do you try to kill those things? Because unlike in other ones, the sort of random spawn camps don't necessarily give you much benefit for killing them. And destroying their camps is not a huge bonus at only 25 energy. That's not a huge amount for the amount of effort that it takes to actually do it. I could probably have saved more money by waiting to get soldiers later on and just, maybe steamrolling them with a profit if they happen to be in the way. That is much more interesting to me than other exploration models. And lastly, the biggest change that they did, in my opinion, for this compared to Civilization on the whole, and this only really applies to Civilization, is the way that they've distributed the good bonuses in those goodie huts. So if you're playing Civilization 5, you're going to go around, you're going to collect ancient ruins, and you're going to be extremely frustrated because you're going to find all the barbarian camps. And then you're going to find somebody got a turn 20 Great Library because they picked up writing from the box. That just is not fun. That is not really an interesting thing to happen in a game. And the reason that this happens is because each of them has a huge variety of different things that could be in it. There's only sort of one type of goodie hut, so you can end up with a really good prize, or you can end up with a really shitty prize. And they can't really just make them all really good prizes, because that would really sort of aggravate the game, in my opinion. Well, it'd be interesting to know what they would do if all goodie huts just had text. Every single ancient ruin had nothing but technology. That would be pretty interesting, but I'd imagine that would break the game, because whoever finds the most of those just wins. But similarly, they could also just have very low monetary prizes or stuff like that. But then you go to Civilization Beyond Earth. You find the resource pods. They're exactly like that. They're all just minor resource boosts. And if this was all there was, there'd be a lot less incentive. People would still want to find these, but there'd be a lot less incentive and frustration to finding these. But at the same time, people would not be as engaged in the active exploration in the early phase, because honestly, exploration for its own sake is not that interesting. You sort of do it, but when you're doing this for a little hunt for things like this, it becomes much more engaging. So that scouting phase becomes much more engaging. What they've done to make it sort of more enticing and make it more relevant, as opposed to something you can just ignore to focus on your economy instead of building an explorer, is they've also added in the ancient ruins, progenitor ruins, the ancient dinosaur bones, and all that other stuff, the exploration areas. And this is a fantastic way to manage the larger bonuses, and these are large bonuses. They're not as significant as the largest ones that you could get in Civilization 5, but they're significantly bigger than the bonuses you get from something like Galactic Civilization, or anything that you would have gotten in a pod or one of these sites from Age of Wonders 3 or anything like that. So these become a great reason to go exploring, because they're big, significant bonuses, but it's very difficult for a player to sort of monopolize these like it was possible to in Civilization 5, or get screwed out of them as easily, because in Civilization 5 you got screwed out of those ancient ruins consistently if you were on a continent that had a lot of other players. You'd be trying to find them. Oh, look, France is over there. He picked it up before I could. That's just lovely. And it was so frustrating because, next turn, France has founded a religion, and you're just like, oh my god, why? Or 25 turns down the line when it's turn 40 into the game, it's like, France has completed the Great Library. And you just know that the only reason that they could accomplish that is because they either got a big... They got a big boost out of that little rune that they found. So those become very frustrating mechanics, especially if all you got was, map upgrades. Those which are by far the worst. So when you're playing in Beyond Earth, though, you know that those are going to have a fairly significant bonus. Whether, like, the worst one I can think of is actually getting an alien unit. But beyond that, everything else is pretty significant. Derelict Settlement with an extra population is a big bonus. The amount of culture that you get from those is rather significant. And the ability to increase your affinity level without having to choose technologies or quests is massive. So the Progenitor Ruins are probably one of the biggest ones in there. And as well, cutting down the tech time can be interesting if you sort of look and see that that's something worth rushing to get something interesting and get an advantage that way. So ultimately, the fact that they've got those sort of two-tiered exploration things makes it so that you're both engaged but not frustrated. It's a lot more fair, it feels, and it's a lot less luck-based, since you know exactly sort of what you're going to be getting approximately. Like, you don't know exactly what you're going to be getting, but you can be pretty sure that, you know, if you pick up a resource pod, the best thing you could get is a solar collector. If you pick up a Progenitor Run, on the other hand, you know that could be a game-changing affinity. It's just that you've only got the one exploration module early on, so you can't just take the Progenitor Rune and then go on to the next one. In all likelihood, as you get that one, the AI is going to get another one somewhere else, or a different one of some other type. And I think that that's really interesting. And second of all, this system actually provides a lot of decision-making and choice again, which is sort of the hallmark of Beyond Earth's exploration phase. When you're exploring these ruins, you're not scouting. So basically, you've got a choice between exploring the map more thoroughly and leaving that ruin behind, risking somebody else taking it, or rushing to the ruin and exploring it and potentially missing out on important map information, like perhaps a better ruin that would have been more important to swipe. Or maybe you could secure the one that you already know about with a soldier while you go and explore with your explorer to hopefully find another one. There's all sorts of different choices that you have to make when you're doing these explorations here, and I think that that makes this game's exploration phase a lot more interesting and a lot more engaging than it is in other traditional 4X style games. Okay, so moving on to the other phases of the game, you've got the expansion and exploit phase. These are sort of rolled into one. These are what you do when you're building your bases, and this is all about using the resources on the map to build up your cities and build up your forces and build towards a victory condition, whichever one you happen to have decided to go towards, usually a little bit after the exploration phase. So this is where you usually get into the actual game of trying to win. This is where you're trying to now go for the long haul here. And what you decide to do as a strategy is going to be significantly influenced by your affinity and by the sort of map layout. If you happen to be near a ridiculous node of one of the three affinity resources, and if your purity also titanium, you're going to want to basically just be happy with where you are and expand mostly for things like money and for the sake of having more cities. But if you are far away from any resource there, like you've got no floatstone, you've got like a pile of 2 xenomass, and there's no Firaxis there, you're going to want to actually go ahead and expand looking for one of those resources and make an active decision as to which affinity you're going to follow at that point. And this sort of system works in sort of strange ways. The actual resource nodes tend to conglomerate, and I've noticed, in sort of different places. Floatstone tends to be in sort of large open planar areas a lot of the time, or near canyons, and I've noticed that the Firaxite tends to be in the poles, and I've noticed that Xenomass tends to be near a lot of jungles or biodiversity. So it makes sense where they are, but where you are on the map is going to sort of dictate which of the affinities you're going to follow to a very large extent. And these resources are actually tremendously important for your ability to actually get further into the game without getting murdered horribly, because they're very important for your military. Now, the expansion and exploitation phase are probably the most similar phases to the game in terms of a Civ game. It is just very Civ feeling. You build your cities, you pick the buildings that you think are going to help your civilization the most, and you sort of continue on upgrading all of your cities. Now, the biggest differences to it are the affinities and trade. Now, trade is much, much more heavily emphasized, and it's the reason that you can see cities sprawl in Civilization Beyond Earth, whereas in Civilization 5, what you typically saw was 3 cities per player, per human player. 3 cities was sort of the optimal setup for a lot of players. Now, in Beyond Earth, because you can get such a huge boost of science and production and food and money from each city that you produce, it's 3 trade routes. Each trade route is worth about a total of maybe each trade route, I would say, is probably worth on average about 14 resources or higher, but you're looking at quite a significant boost in total resources from a significantly limited investment in trade routes. And the only downside to them is they can be plundered by the AI. Never worry about them being plundered by aliens. Reverse polarity of your ultrasonic fences is always mandatory. It's one of the few building upgrades I think is just purely mandatory, but other than that, a lot of them are quite interesting. But that one, purely mandatory. So once you've got that, you're basically going to be trying to get as many of those trade routes open as possible, and having more cities gives you more trade routes. In Civilization 5, more cities did not give you more trade routes. That was capped by civilization and based on wonders and social policies and tech. So basically, you always had the same number of trade routes, and there's not a whole lot you could do about that. In Civilization Beyond Earth, that's not true. The more cities you have, the more wealthy you are. So what you tend to see is that huge number of cities. This makes the game feel a lot more crowded. It makes it feel like a much bigger race for space and for colony spots. The AI takes full advantage of this fact and tends to have just a full-on blitz of city production, producing city after city after city, which does get a little bit annoying, but it does add a little bit of a different flavor to the mid-game here. And as well, this also makes it so that you can have that big feeling empire. I think a lot of people were sort of disillusioned in Civilization 5 by the fact that you're basically playing like a city-state. A lot of the time, you're not a big sprawling empire across a lot of the map, or at least if you do that, you're crippling your tech and you're crippling your culture. So it becomes too costly to run those sort of large empires, and frankly, it takes so long before a new building or a new colony actually starts being productive. So you end up in this situation in this game where it's very easy to get a new colony up and running with internal trade routes is just magnificent. And you can definitely make use of that system to make much larger, more sprawling empires if you want to. It might be a little bit too powerful right now to be doing that, so it might have to be scaled backward. It's at the point where I think that having a small civilization just is not viable at all, so they definitely need to address that potentially, but I think that they maybe just want to give you that feeling that having a large, sprawling empire is a good thing, so that could be definitely an option. Now, for the affinities, I do like the character for all the affinities. They're all quite interesting. They all play fairly differently. The fact that Purity can sort of really get anywhere they want with their units, because a lot of them are Lev, is actually quite advantageous, especially since they're a lot of siege units. The problem is that very late game, this becomes slightly redundant because they've got a hover artillery unit and they've got hover tanks. So the Lev and the Lev Destroyer become less important because they can become a little bit sized out. So they're masters of that sort of middle game in warfare. And they're also the best at tile improvements. They're sort of tech path that you get when you're following Purity. They've got the best bonuses and boosts to tile improvements. Supremacy is my favorite of the factions. They scale extremely well into the late game, but they're the weakest probably in the early game. The CNDR, it's got like lower stats than the Battlesuit. The Battlesuit, by the way, is an amazing unit. It's the reason that Purity goes for Titanium. It's got slightly higher stats than the Cinder or the Alien Swarm, and it is just a real rock-solid unit that uses Titanium instead of using Floatstone. So later on, when you start using Floatstone, you've got a full reserve of it, because you don't have like a million Cinders running around sucking up all of your Firaxis, for example. But the Purity unit and Purity faction is very interesting and very powerful in sort of early mid-game compared to the other guys. Supremacy I find very interesting thematically, and late game I like the fact that their units scale up so well. Once you've actually got a sizable army, the Purity or the Supremacy faction is pretty much unstoppable. They've got these large formations of troops that work together, and their units are just so strong when they're in conjunction with one another that they can wipe out much stronger units pretty easily, pretty damn easily. By contrast, you've got the Harmony units. Harmony units, I think, actually are a little bit too weak. I think that Harmony needs a little bit of love here. and I could be wrong about this, like, their bonuses are that they've got huge bonuses when they're not adjacent to any allies, or they've got huge bonuses to exploding themselves like terrorist bombers in the enemy's face. Now, the first one is actually very problematic. It becomes much of a bigger positioning puzzle than the supremacy units. You'd think that the supremacy units, no, all you have to do with the supremacy units is keep them together in a blob. With the harmony units, if you keep your units together, your units obviously get significantly weaker. They lose those bonuses, they become weaker than their equivalents in other factions, and they just get trounced. Like a brawler will lose to an apostle if they're both, if the apostle is adjacent to units. Like if you've got like 5 apostles or whatever in a choke point or whatever, they're going to win against a single brawler or 3 brawlers spread out across a line. And that's the thing, though, is like when you're trying to actually attack something, you need to focus all of your forces together as much as possible so that they can each do as much damage as is possible. Harmony units sort of contradict that notion. Now, you could just make all of your units suiciders, but they end up with really bad combat stats. And it's not too difficult for me to take out those units and then use abilities from whatever, like nodes, to heal back up to full without really having been affected by their suicide ability. And you don't take much damage from them because they don't have the bonuses. So ultimately, I think that Harmony, out of the different affinities, probably needs a little bit more love than the other factions. And Supremacy in particular feels like it's a little bit too strong sometimes, especially with their victory condition. Once they built the Emancipation Gate, it is much faster to put the units through that Emancipation Gate if you've been preparing for it than it is to get units, to form colonies with those extremely slow-ass moving colonists that you get if you're doing Purity. And of course the Mind Flower is a little bit of a pain to make, and Contact is just a real nightmare to do because it has like 4 steps that are all very long. You have to build like 3 wonders as Contact Victory. But yeah, all the factions are very interesting, and I do like that sort of diversity between them. It's another point of choice that you can make to sort of change up your civilization. I wonder if they're going to include more of those in DLC. That would be pretty much fantastic, although I don't know, of course, what they would do if they did that. But essentially, they're all very interesting, but a little bit unbalanced, in different points of the game in particular. I guess Supremacy's weakness is that they're a little bit weaker early on. None of their units are stellar without large formations of troops, which is hard to get early on in the game, whereas Harmony, if you've got like 1 or 2 of your units, then that 40% bonus is just gigantic, whereas if you're Purity, the fact that you've got battle suits is gigantic because they just are gigantic. So I guess it does sort of even out in the grand scheme of things, but you tend not to see large-scale conflicts until late game, which I find creates a bit of a Supremacy bias, but that could just be me. And that is pretty much everything in the sort of expansion and exploit phases. It's all about that sort of exploiting resources to produce those different tech units. So discussing a little bit about the different tech units, especially the mid-game ones, is a little bit important to discussing that, but let's move on to exterminate. Exterminate is where you march out your armies and you crush the enemy, or realistically also you use those resources to defend yourself when they're trying to attack you and you're trying to do the Emancipation Gate victory or Contact victory or whatever. And while you're waiting for that to happen, which is basically just sit there and wait while your score thing moves and you sort of micro around your score whatevers, but during this phase, it's all about having those large-scale armies that your city that you've gained from the expansion and the exploration and the exploit phase, all those elements come together to create whatever is going to occur in the end game. And this is where the states begin to war with each other much more frequently and in much more serious ways. You're going to see large, high-tech armies that are going to be crashing against each other, blah, blah, blah. And the AI I noticed was quite easy at the start. I think they patched it because they became significantly harder quite recently, but you typically find like large-scale formations of enemy troops just sort of washing against you, and this is sort of the area of the game where it almost inevitably falls apart a little bit. Now, Beyond Earth is shorter than Civilization 5. The actual timescale from start to finish feels a lot tighter, so you don't have that same sort of drawn-out slog that you sometimes feel in a Civilization game where, you know, it's still the Renaissance, it's been like 200 turns to get there, and you're just hoping that someone does something somewhere, but part of this, I think, can be attributed to the tech web system. It becomes much faster to move towards any particular victory condition technology, whereas the linear tech conditions in Civilization meant that you had to go through multiple eras just to get anywhere close to it. And because of that shortening, you don't have that same grind near the end of the game where everyone's got their big cities. They're usually doing in and out wars where it's just sort of a minor war, nothing really changes hands, nothing really happens. And maybe you conquer a couple enemy cities, but ultimately, you know, cities are extremely durable. The enemies have usually fairly large armies. And it's just really boring after a while, sort of microing around your empire while you sort of wait for your cultural victory to take over and cause you to win. This game sort of makes that much faster, so that is a positive change, I think. You could, of course, set the game length to the marathon, in which case it becomes a horrible grind again if that's your thing. But ultimately, this game, I think, has a very similar end game to a lot of Civilization games. It's the least interesting part of the game. It's where you're sort of like just waiting for your Emancipation Gate to fill up. You're just waiting for your Purity colonists to finish moving out of their gate into your settlements. You're just waiting for your Harmony Flower to finish talking to the planet, or you're just waiting for your satellites to talk to the progenitor aliens. It's a lot of just sort of waiting there, defending against waves of enemies. And like the unit diversity and the way that the units actually work makes this a little bit interesting, but even then, like, the wars can become very bogged down, it can become very tiresome and very meddlesome. And ultimately, I think that this is where most 4X games fall flat. So I do have to give kudos to Beyond Earth for shortening that experience a little bit. And it's kind of the problem of a lot of conquest-type games. Either you get crushed early on, or you end up in this dominant position late game where you're just rolling over everything, and every time it's just a chore doing all the little bits of management before you hit end turn, because your empire has become so bloated and large and cumbersome that it takes a long time to finish doing whatever it is you're doing. Or, you know, you're just waiting for your culture victory to tick over and you've only got 3 cities and all you're doing is smashing end turn over and over and over again for 100 turns. Either way it sort of goes, that's kind of how the game is, the game genre is. The start and the middle is always the most interesting part of these games, and that goes for things like Total War, that goes for all sorts of turn-based strategy games, grand strategy sort of games. And I think that Beyond Earth, you know, the warfare, pretty similar to Civilization 5. I'm not going to say that it's different enough for me to really say it was great or it was something I really enjoyed. It's Civ War. It's the same as it sort of always has been. Well, it's Civ 5 War, which is actually kind of pretty different from Civilization 4 and earlier. But, you know, it's not really the focus of the game, in my opinion. It's just the first 3 X's that I think are the big parts of it. They haven't done anything, I think, that revolutionizes that last phase, which would have, if they had, this would have been the best Civilization game ever. All they've managed to do is sort of ease the pain of it going into there. So that's all 4 X's of the game, of Beyond Earth, and talking about in that context I think is the most useful way, because those 4 X's are really how people play the game and how people think about these sorts of games. So talking about how each of those elements works in this, how it meshes together and how it comes apart maybe, is probably the best way for me to be talking about this, which is why I decided to talk about it like that. But moving on from that, let's talk about the fiddly bits that I don't really care about, but some people are going to be interested in anyway. The aesthetic of the game is pretty interesting. They've only got 3 city types, though, which is interesting, but I think a little bit disappointing. Now, it would have taken them probably ages longer if they had done, for example, Pan-Asian harmony building. You know, if you had a faction-unique building style, like Asian-style buildings or Australian-style buildings or European-style buildings, and then added in purity, harmony, or supremacy elements to that aesthetic, and you'd end up with a huge number of different permutations of architecture, but I think that would have been definitely something that made the cities pop and stand out more. As it is, though, I do like the harmony, purity, and supremacy aesthetics. They all look appealing in their own sort of way, but I definitely do think that they had a missed opportunity there to a certain degree. In terms of the rest of the aesthetic, all the units for every faction looks the same. They're easily identified because of the tags above their heads, however, which means that from a UI perspective, it's fine. There's nothing wrong with it as far as that goes. Some people have had difficulties with the TechWeb UI, which I can sort of understand. I personally don't have those problems because I know how to use the search bar. But other than that, you're typically going to find people looking at that and wondering what the hell each tech actually allows you to do. And there are some mods that change the color for that. I don't personally find those necessary, but if that is your thing, that is there to fix that. It would have been potentially nice if they had some color coding or something like that to make it easier. I can definitely see why people would want that. But beyond that, you're looking at a lot of units that look very similar to one another. All the Purity factions will look the same. All of the Supremacy faction, all the starting factions all look the same. They could have definitely done something to differentiate them. I'm not sure what they could have, but making them sort of more visually distinct in some way by like perhaps incorporating the faction color into their uniforms, into their aesthetic or in some way would have definitely been something I would appreciate. But, you know, maybe that would have looked really ugly. As for the aesthetic, other than that, the world looks really good to me. I like the way that everything looks. The cities are quite impressive. I love the evolution of them from a small, tiny one-person settlement to a big, glowing, like black and orange metropolis, or that sweeping green, almost Bioshocky-looking city there, or the ancient Roman sort of taupe, I guess, architecture that you've got there. All of those, I think, look fantastic. The world itself looks really good. I like the way that the terrain, of course, looks in this game. And the aliens also look quite interesting to me. Like, maybe adding even more types of aliens for later on in the game that don't show up until later. Something, you know, like a siege worm for a late game would be hilarious, but as it is, the aliens look pretty diverse and they look very interesting. And I can't really complain about the sound either, although I can't praise it as much. Honestly, the sound in a Civilization game sort of blends in with the background as it should. And because of that, it's not really anything fantastic, and it's not really anything notable. The sound effects, though, for the guns firing and stuff like that is quite good. The units marching all sounds fairly obvious. So, all in all, the sound, not great, but it does what it's supposed to be doing. The one disappointing thing, of course, is that they haven't really got anyone that I can recognize for the voices. Like, they had Leonard Nimoy for Civilization 4 or something like that. I think it was Leonard Nimoy in 4. The guy in Civilization 5 had a very distinctive voice, but wasn't that good either. But the big thing as well is that they didn't have a very impressive opening cutscene compared to Civilization 4, which obviously had that Baba Yetu as the main song, one of the best songs like in video gaming ever. So it was okay from a technical standpoint. There's nothing that really stands out as amazing. I do like the look of it, though. I think there were some... If they had used the aesthetic style that they did, but also added in a more faction-specific look to the units and buildings, that would have concreted it as an amazing-looking game. But as it is, everything looks a little bit too monotonous to say that it is an amazing-looking game. So that is pretty much everything I need to say about this game. Yeah, I think we're done here. So anyway... I hope you found this enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you all next time.